The thing looks like a giant paper plane. Few would ever dare to roll down a runway in a Cold War experiment like this. Yet, on December 1st, 1977, test pilot Bill Park is already strapped in. His engines roar, the entire aircraft starts to tremble. The flight systems are so unstable that it's said no pilot can ever hope to control them. Still, Park knows that if he can somehow get this thing off the ground, he'll become the first man to fly an invisible jet. Francis Gary Powers had missed his chance in Korea. Ever since he was a kid, he had dreamed of taking to the skies in one of America's finest aircraft. But when the time finally came, a sudden attack of appendicitis left him grounded, looking up as the rest of his gunnery school classmates took off for Asian skies. By the time he recovered and returned to training, the war was over. With no evident path forward in the Air Force, Powers began to consider that his best chance to fulfill his need to fly might be as a commercial pilot. But by 26, he had already aged out of eligibility for commercial programs. It seemed as if Powers' dream of becoming a renowned pilot was over. But luckily for him, one afternoon, a group of mysterious men in dark suits appeared at the Air Force hangar where he was stationed. They weren't part of the regular chain of command. These men were CIA agents, recruited for a top-secret program involving experimental aircraft so advanced that even most within the military had never heard of them. And they believed Powers was the perfect man to fly one. At the agency, Powers was introduced to one of the most secretive aviation projects in American history, the U-2 program. Engineers had managed to put together a bird that could soar higher than any aircraft ever had, cruising at more than 70,000 feet above enemy territory, nearly touching the edge of space. However, even at that unbelievable altitude, it could still capture razor-sharp photographs of Soviet bases and missile sites with cutting-edge camera systems that no foreign scientists could match. It was the most advanced spy plane the United States had ever created, and for Powers, it was a chance for redemption. But what he didn't know was that this remarkable aircraft had one fatal weakness his enemies could still exploit. It was May 1st, 1966, when Francis Gary Powers took off in his U-2, bound for the Soviet Union. It wasn't his first reconnaissance flight. For years, he and his fellow pilots had crossed enemy skies unchallenged. But even if the Soviets couldn't strike back, they could still see the intruders, ghostly dots tracing across their radar screens. As Powers approached the industrial city of Sverdlovsk, deep in the Ural Mountains, Soviet anti-air stations began to sound the alarm. His U-2 had been spotted. A formation of MiG interceptors scrambled into the air. Guided by ground control, they hunted the American intruder through the cold sky. But the U-2 was far beyond their reach, climbing higher where the air was thin, and the Soviet jets could barely breathe. But the communists still had one card left to play. On the ground below, missile crews rushed in to ready one of their newest weapons, the S-75 Divina. Orders crackled over radios, and in minutes, 14 missiles roared skyward, streaking toward Powers. Then, a blinding flash. One missile found its mark. Powers would spend almost 2 years in Soviet captivity, and even after America managed to bring him home through a prisoner exchange, the nation's situation in the skies had never looked worse. As U.S. troops began deploying to Vietnam, the Air Force quickly realized that none of its aircraft, not even the fastest, most advanced Predators in its arsenal, were safe anymore. Soviet-supplied air defenses, paired with increasingly sophisticated radar systems and command-guided missiles, could track and destroy them with a precision the U.S. had never encountered before. If America failed to respond to this technological threat at once, the skies over the Soviet Union and every communist-backed nation would soon be off limits, cutting off any chance of future intelligence gathering or an aerial strike if the Cold War ever turned hot. And that possibility appeared to loom closer by the day. But if even the mighty U-2 had fallen, it would take far more than an upgraded model to tip the scales back in America's favor. They would need an entirely new kind of aircraft, one that harnessed an entirely new kind of technology, capable of outsmarting even the most advanced Soviet radar systems. They needed an invisible aircraft. The top-secret program, named Project Harvey, after the 1950 film about a giant invisible rabbit posed requirements so ambitious and surreal that some companies declined outright. If America was ever going to achieve this, it would need to think outside the box, employing the most radical and fearless team of engineers ever assembled. They would need the minds at Skunk Works. For decades, Lockheed's Advanced Development Program, better known by its internal codename Skunk Works, had produced some of the nation's most groundbreaking and unconventional designs. From the twin-bomb World War II fighter, the P-38 Lightning, to the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet, completed in a record 143 days, the division had earned a reputation for making the impossible fly. Even though they hadn't been invited to the party, Lockheed's engineers soon caught wind of DARPA's bizarre new project, and they wanted a piece of the action. Heads of Lockheed approached DARPA directly and asked to be included in the program. Officials were hesitant. Another major contractor was the last thing their secret initiative needed. But with Soviet missiles and radar systems multiplying by the hundreds across the Iron Curtain, they could use the extra help. Still, Lockheed would be at a disadvantage, granted no official contract and no funding, due to limited resources. Sources say DARPA would initially offer Lockheed just $1 in exchange for their work on the project. Nevertheless, the company did not back out. The chance to redefine the future of flight was worth any sacrifice, including spending hundreds of thousands of their own dollars on a project that might never leave the ground. As the program began, every hand at Skunk Works tried to answer the same question: how to build an aircraft powerful enough to fly hundreds of miles through enemy airspace, photograph the Soviet Union's most secretive sites, and even deliver a strike, all while remaining undetectable. Mathematicians wrestled with the problem, but even the brightest minds at Lockheed couldn't find an answer. But just as the team began to wonder whether entering the competition had been a mistake, engineers stumbled across an obscure research paper that would change everything. Written over a decade earlier by physicist Pyotr Ufimtsev, the study claimed to have no military value, likely the only reason Moscow even allowed it to be published abroad. But as Skunk Works engineers pored over its translated pages, they realized just how grave a mistake the Soviets had made. Ufimtsev's work described the mathematical principles of radar reflection, revealing how energy could be scattered using flat, angled surfaces. In theory, an aircraft built with such geometry could deflect radar waves away from the source, making itself nearly invisible. Some even noticed how the shape resembled an already existing shape, the Hope Diamond, a legendary 17th century jewel housed at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. It was a promising concept, yet few believed it could ever work. And as the first prototype began to take shape, its strange angular form earned the nickname the Hopeless Diamond, an aircraft whose only hope for achieving invisibility would come from the fact that it might never be completed. With a basic idea of the shape their new aircraft would need to evade radar, the engineers at Skunk Works now faced a new challenge, defining the exact angles and dimensions for every plate and corner needed to build their creation. Testing every single prototype would take years and cost millions. Luckily for Lockheed, they just brought a new assistant on board, one who could test dozens of designs at once and report back to the bosses which silhouette had the best chance of slipping past Soviet radar. That assistant was called Echo 1, an advanced computer that, while known for being prone to occasional errors, offered the team their best shot at predicting how radar waves would react to different shapes. The final silhouette, which Echo 1 recommended after numerous calculations, was even stranger than anything the engineers had imagined, a bizarre, faceted body made up entirely of sharp, flat angles. Kelly Johnson, the legendary head of Skunk Works, was horrified the moment he saw the abomination, barking to his team, quote, "Our old D-21 drone has a lower radar cross-section than that goddamn diamond." But no matter how many times the Skunk Works team reran the simulation, the answer was always the same. This was the shape their aircraft needed. Reluctantly, the designers rolled up their sleeves. In the workshop, they began crafting a series of wooden prototypes to test the configuration proposed by Echo 1, mapping out where every system of the future aircraft might fit. One of them was brought to the wind tunnel, where more than one believed it would collapse before everyone's eyes. However, as the trial began, instead of breaking apart, the model held steady, showing that even with its off figure, the design could actually hold firm. Still, aerodynamic success meant nothing if it couldn't do the one thing it had been created for. And before anyone at Skunk Works could celebrate, the strange aircraft would first have to demonstrate it could fool radar better than its rival. By now, the only company aside from Lockheed left in the Project Harvey competition was Northrop. Their teams were not working with a computer assistant as powerful as Echo 1, and to construct their prototype, known as the Northrop XST, they had to work closely with Hughes Radar Systems Group, one of America's leading military technology companies, just to get a sense of what they were actually achieving. It was far from an ideal method for assembling a groundbreaking aircraft. Complex calculations and technical details had to be passed across multiple teams before the engineers on the floor could even begin implementing them in their working model. Still, after painstaking months of trial and error, the designers at Northrop finally managed to put together a solid enough model that threatened to topple Lockheed's design. For the grand showdown, both models were taken to the deserts of New Mexico for a so-called pull-off, in which each aircraft was mounted on top of a metal pole and positioned at different angles. From there, radar crews would try to pinpoint their exact location on their systems. Whichever aircraft reflected back the least amount of radar waves would be declared the winner. Then suddenly, operators found something. For a moment, hearts sank. But as Skunk Works member Edward Burnett would later recall, quote, "People were saying, 'We see your model.' But it turns out they did not see the model. They were seeing a lot of other things, not the actual vehicle." The radar operators could see the pole on which the aircraft was mounted. Some even claimed they could detect bird droppings that had begun to pile up on the fuselage, but the aircraft itself was living up to its promise. Its radar cross-section, designed to be no larger than the eye of an eagle, was reportedly being perceived by radar as just 1,000th the size of Lockheed's D-21 reconnaissance drone, the most stealthy aircraft the company had produced up until then. There was little the Northrop XST could do to challenge results like this, and even though testing showed that their model produced a very respectable low radar signature, it was still about 10 times more noticeable than Lockheed's from certain angles. Upon its pull-off victory, Lockheed's model was cleared to move forward with the construction of a set of prototypes from which test pilots could assess firsthand both the aircraft's stealth capabilities and flight performance. This new set of aircraft, now officially labeled as Lockheed's Have Blue project, aimed to make the already impressive technology Skunk Works engineers had created even more elusive, making it quieter, less visible, and almost impossible to detect across the radio, infrared, and visual spectrums. Although the prototype would not match the size or sophistication of a fully operational stealth fighter, its development was anything but modest. Even after the government provided $20 million, had to convince Lockheed management to add another $10 million just to be able to complete 2 working models. Still, even those seemingly generous sums were far from ideal for a team attempting to rewrite the rules of aviation. By the time the funds ran dry, however, there was nowhere else to turn. If the engineers wanted to see their creation fly, they would have to get resourceful. To save both time and money, the designers decided to borrow parts from other aircraft with compatible dimensions. The landing gear came from the Northrop F-8 fighter, while the 2 General Electric J-85 GE-4As were taken straight from the T-2C Buckeye trainer. The finished prototype was not the most impressive-looking aircraft Lockheed had ever produced. It weighed just under 9,000 pounds, lacked an air refueling system, and had no pressurized cabin, meaning pilots could only operate it within a very limited range and altitude. But perhaps the most worrying limitation was its flight performance. With every design decision focused on reducing radar visibility, aerodynamics had become almost an afterthought during assembly. To make it operational, engineers had to install a fly-by-wire system borrowed from the F-16, which would constantly adjust the aircraft's trajectory in real time to keep it stable during flight and prevent any test run from ending in disaster. On December 1st, 1977, test pilot Bill Park rolled the Lockheed Have Blue prototype, HB-1001, down the runway on the shores of Groom Lake, within the restricted desert of Area 51. The aircraft surged ahead, gathering speed until it sliced through the desert air at nearly 600 miles per hour. Once airborne, Park tried to tame the beast. The aircraft was temperamental, and if not for the onboard computer constantly correcting its movements, there's no telling how far Park would have gotten. According to Lockheed documents, quote, "The airframe exhibited just about every mode of unstable behavior possible for an aircraft. The only thing it didn't do was tip back on its tail when it was parked." Yet somehow, HB-1001 held together. Back on the ground, radar crews rushed into position, fully aware they had only minutes to gather data before Park was forced to bring the prototype back down. One by one, radar systems began to scan the area. Antennas tracked the sky, but when the systems locked onto the area where the aircraft should have been, the signal kept vanishing. Occasionally, a faint blip appeared, only to disappear seconds later. Operators weren't sure if they were seeing a bird, a glitch, or Bell Park himself. Lockheed had done what once seemed like the stuff of science fiction. They'd built an aircraft that could fly and vanish into thin air. For the next several months, Bill Park and fellow test pilot Ken Dyson continued pushing the limits of the HB-1001. To take the trials one step further, the prototype was also subjected to flight chase tests, with both men taking turns flying F-15 Eagle fighters, simulating real-life hunts with a half-blue mid-air to assess how it might fare against air-to-air threats. Despite going up against a far more advanced and agile aircraft, the HB-1001 didn't disappoint. Its stealth capabilities allowed it to vanish into the clouds, slipping out of radar and visual range, even when the F-15's guns had closed in for the kill. As the summer of 1978 approached, Lockheed's engineers were feeling confident that nothing could bring the half-blue down. But during the 36th test flight, just as Park was nearing the ground for final landing, something went wrong. Dyson, who was trailing close behind, later recalled, quote, "Just before touchdown, the airplane pitched up. It seemed to slam down hard. Park raised the gear on the go-around, and when he tried to extend it again on approach, only one of the mains and the nose wheel came down. All this time, fuel was running low. I suggested he climb to 10,000 feet for ejection. He started climbing, but the engines began flaming out from lack of fuel. With no other option left, Bill Park ejected only seconds before the aircraft went down. He survived, but his injuries were severe enough to end his testing days on board the Half-Blue. Despite the crash, officials decided the project had proven too promising to stop. Within a month, the second prototype was taking off. It incorporated several improvements based on data gathered from the first model, including a new radar-absorbent coating that made it even harder to detect. Much like its fallen sibling, HB-1002's initial flights exceeded expectations. Though still plagued by unstable flight dynamics, the aircraft completed over 50 successful missions throughout the following year without major incident. It would never see combat, but as a test platform, it proved invaluable, helping pilots and engineers master the once mystical art of aerial stealth. By many accounts, this was one of the most game-changing and valuable aircraft Lockheed had ever built. But by January 11th, 1979, the Half-Blue project was again in danger of disappearing. As HB-1002 took off on its 52nd mission, a hydraulic leak had ignited a fire in the engine, threatening to consume the entire aircraft, one system at a time. Before too long, ejection became the only way out. Once again, the test pilot survived, but the Half-Blue prototype was lost, crashing and burning in the desert below. To protect its classified design, what remained of the wreckage was quickly buried somewhere within the Nellis Air Force range, hidden beneath sand so that no foreign hands could ever find it. It was an undignified end for the aircraft that had unlocked the secrets of stealth flight. But despite its unfortunate ending, HB-1002 had fallen only a few flights shy of completing its full test program, and the results were undeniable. Project Half-Blue was a triumph. The United States government did not waste time granting Lockheed Skunk Works the go-ahead to build a new, fully operational stealth aircraft that would incorporate every lesson learned from its now-lost prototypes. It would take a few more years before this final model took to the skies, but when it did, as the Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk in the early 1980s, it would change aerial warfare forever, becoming the first warplane capable of entering and exiting enemy territory without ever being seen, something that was not even believed possible before Half-Blue came along.